what I always tell people is this is the most asked question in cannabis. How much do I take? Everywhere I've ever been, I've been waiting, in dispensaries and all over. And that's what everyone always asks, how much do I take? And right now, sort of the way that people approach it is start slow and see what happens, or based on your weight or things like that. And as I stated, we're finding that these things really are not, very exact. And people are spending a lot of time and a lot of money to figure out where it's at.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Different Leaf, a show for new and experienced cannabis consumers. I'm Brit Smith. This episode, we're going to learn how understanding our DNA can tell us the best way to dose our marijuana. There's a lot of innovation in the cannabis industry, and as you may know by now, I tend to geek out on all things science. So I was really interested to learn about this company called GreenWay DNA. Kind of like 23andMe and those other genetic testing companies, GreenWay DNA collects your saliva samples so they can analyze your genetic information. But instead of telling you what you're allergic to or who you're related to, they provide THC and CBD dosing recommendations specific to your body. Of course, I had to give it a try, and I have to say the results that I got really opened my eyes to my own health and wellness, and how I've essentially been using weed in the wrong way. The report gave me advice on the best methods of ingestion that would work for me and the ratios of CBD to THC that I should use if I want to treat specific ailments that I told them that I struggle with, like anxiety, insomnia, and pain. So today, we're going to take a look at the results of my test with GreenWay DNA's founder, Wagner, and Chief Development Officer, Robert Brown. First up, Rye is going to tell us how this whole thing works. Okay, so this is a fairly new technology, and you guys are basically testing people's DNA to see which cannabinoids and what ratio of cannabinoids might work best for their personal genetics. Is that right?
That's exactly right. As well stated. Each of us as an individual has a unique genetic makeup, and that makeup, our genetic composition, really determines how we respond to a lot of different types of stimulus, how we respond to different foods, how we respond to different environmental conditions. And in fact, it helps determine how we respond to cannabis and the cannabinoids that are found in cannabis.
Yeah, so I used to be a medical marijuana card holder when I was in California. Unfortunately, in Massachusetts, it costs a little bit more, so my household could afford one. So I'm not able to access that sort of stream of knowledge. Like, I don't have a medical marijuana doctor that I usually go to. My husband does. He's a veteran, so, we saw it very important for him to have access to a medical marijuana doctor. So from what he's always been told, and from what I was told in California when I first applied for my marijuana card, it was all about a lot of THC. And what you guys seem to have told me in my report is that a really low amount of THC with a large ratio of CBD is actually what's best for me. Do you find that that's sort of a typical finding for a lot of people?
Yes, we do. And I think it's in part based on how people have come into using medical marijuana. I think that the understanding of how THC works is much more straightforward and well understood than the pleiotropic mechanisms, the multiple mechanisms, if you will, in how CBD works. So it's a trend. Again, each person is very individual. And if you take 100 people and you look at them from least to greatest weight or youngest to oldest, you'll find that there's variation in the recommendations that is not linearly correlated, if you will, but it's really individual. So you can have somebody who's older that will take less than somebody who's younger, or somebody who's older that is recommended to take more than somebody who's younger, based on what we call your genetic weight, weighting the ability of you yourself to properly process and use cannabinoids based on your own metabolism and your own genetics.
Can I ask how you how you do this? I know that it's an incredibly complex question, but I'm a bit of a science nerd. Could you get into some of the nerdy science stuff with me and tell me how you take my spit and figure out from that which ratio of cannabinoids works best for me? Is that a very crazy question to ask?
That's a perfectly reasonable question to ask, and it's one that we try to explain to people in all different ways that are possible for us to explain. So I'm happy to take a few minutes here to tell you. The basic approach is that the way that you interact with cannabinoids from cannabis is through a system called the endocannabinoid system, which is inherent to all of us. So we make within our body forms of cannabinoids that are normally processed by us internally using various enzymes, using various signal transduction molecules and various receptors that communicate the amount and the type of cannabinoid that your system is going to use. Mm-hmm. What we have done is we have looked at the medical data around these particular genes that encode for the receptors, which perceive the cannabinoid. And there are different receptors for THC than there are for CBD. Mm-hmm. We've looked at the signal transduction, that is when the cannabinoid is perceived by the cell. Just like if our skin perceives it that we're cold, what's that reaction? How do we transmit that perception into a reaction? So we look at how that perception is translated into a response by looking at signal transduction and then looking at the metabolic turnover of the cannabinoids in your cells. Each one of the genes that are involved in those various steps have genetic variation. Mm-hmm. So your particular gene for one receptor is going to be different than my particular gene at that receptor. And it's just part of a natural variation that occurs across all humans.
Is it likely to be similar with my siblings or my parents?
Yes, the variants that you would have inherited from your parents, and you probably share some of those with your siblings, but you also probably have some uniqueness because you're going to get one copy of each gene, one from your father, one from your mother, and so you may have a particular variant from your father that your sibling may not have. Mm-hmm. It's just the nature of genetics. So that's why we're each, even if we're related to one another, each very unique.
That's super interesting. All right, I've nerded out. So I've heard that 23andMe and the Ancestry DNA, and there's, loads of other companies that will take your DNA and like test for things like family connections or fertility or allergies or like food sensitivity. So is this test kind of based on that same science?
I think the trick for GreenWay DNA is twofold. So this science, we say it's a new science, but it's actually a fairly well-established science in pharmacology. It's the general field known as pharmacogenomics, that is using your genes to predict how you will respond to different types of pharmacological drugs. What we've done is we've taken that whole endocannabinoid pathway, looked at all of the variants that we can easily test for that and reliably test for using a clinical level of methodology based on DNA sequencing. And we gather all that information for you. We then use a mathematical algorithm to tell us what your genetic weight is. So in some situations, you'll find an individual has both a high propensity to easily receive THC and at the same time an ability to not turn over the THC. So a small amount of THC in their system will last a long time and they'll see it very quickly. And so how you take those different pieces together and provide a simplified report or summary is really the what is novel and behind what GreenWay DNA is doing, is taking a lot of complex information and making it accessible to an individual.
That's really something that's lacking from the market. I've never seen anything like this before. Robert, It seems to me like there would be a huge demand for this kind of thing. Do you have a lot of customers that are usually just sort of trying to figure things out themselves, or are people usually coming to you through a doctor, like to try and pinpoint exactly what would be best for them?
So we're getting interest from a lot of different points. As Rai stated earlier, we do have a lot of interest, and we're working a lot with the medical community because, again, we're looking at this from a clinical level. So we're really trying to be as precise as we can. And I will say that what I always tell people is this is the most asked question in cannabis: how much do I take? Everywhere I've ever been, I've been waiting, in dispensaries and all over. And that's what everyone always asks: how much do I take? And right now, sort of the way that people approach it is start slow and see what happens, or based on your weight or things like that. And as I stated, we're finding that these things really are not, very exact. And people are spending a lot of time and a lot of money to figure out where it's at.
That's a really interesting point. Whenever I go to the dispensary, I've been told, try this strain at a low grade THC level and take one puff and see how long it takes to really affect you. And if it doesn't, then the next time take 2 puffs or try a higher THC level. Right. But I've never even considered that higher THC level is not what my body needs. It's not what actually would be healthy for my body and what would help me through pain and insomnia and things that I'm, sometimes I am looking to just sort of get that euphoric head buzz and get high, and I want something high THC. But I didn't ever really consider changing up the level of CBD. I don't know that when you go to a dispensary, there's that many CBD flowers on offer. I'm a smoker big time, and there's just not that much CBD flower. So I tend to overlook a lot of the CBD products and even the idea of mixing them together with my THC. But Rai, maybe you can talk a little bit about what the entourage effect is and how that impacts, when you take a lot of CBD, you have to take a small amount of THC just to kind of make it work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, that's a really important point that many people overlook. The CBD works through its interaction with a number of different types of receptors. When you take a dosage of CBD, you're impacting these receptors such as your serotonin receptor, opioid receptor, a number of other receptors that influence a lot of your physiology. THC operates through a parallel system with the CNR receptors, the basic receptors that we understand very well. So in essence, CBD influences your metabolism through a wide range of different receptors, whereas THC really influences your system through one, maybe 2 receptors, but one primary receptor. And those responses that you have are a bit of a cascade of parallel pathways working. Mm-hmm. And if you can really strike that balance between having the right amount of THC and the right amount of CBD, you can find that really well fine-tuned balance of activating those different multiple routes to changing your physiology in the right way. So CBD without THC won't give you that combined type of effect because their entry into how your physiology changes is independent and largely parallel. But when you take them together, then you have this combined effect that is really, really what I think most people are striving for.
Hey gang, we've got an episode coming up with our favorite cannabis specialist, Dr. Peter Grinspoon, and we're taking questions about anything pertaining to medical marijuana. So if you want to know something specific from Dr. Grinspoon, send us your questions on social media. Just search for @DifferentLeaf or email us at podcast@differentleaf.com. Also, make sure you're subscribed to this podcast wherever you're listening to us right now so you don't miss the episode with Dr. Grinspoon. I've done this test. You were all kind enough and gracious enough to send me my own little test box. Our publisher, Michael, also did one. I was meaning to ask him what he thought about taking it, because I had some feedback. It is not easy to spit into a tube 30 minutes after you've last had something.